Hello, this time it's Object 27 of 100 objects that I tell the history and philosophy of Summerhill School. So it's the teapot. Now it's the teapot because at Summerhill tea is very important, tea or coffee, or hot drinks. We have two tea times. We have a tea in the morning, which breaks up the morning day, and then we have another tea in the afternoon that used to start the actual afternoon lessons. I think all it used to be before. It used to break up the afternoon, but not the afternoon timetable. Nowadays, the timetable is a typical state school sort of timetable in terms of start and finish, and so the afternoon tea does break up the lessons for a break. Anyway, we're going to talk about those tea times and what they mean and why we have them. And we have them at weekends as well, not just Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but also at the weekends. So, the teapot. I think it's, with these histories, it's interesting to think about the wider histories of in terms of the nature of meeting over tea, in a sense. And it's interesting that the first tea houses were created in the 1890s, like Lyons Tea House in London, and they became a very important part and a recognised part of the history of suffrage, and the suffragettes and suffragists, the women organising for the right to vote, had really nowhere to meet in terms of informal social meetings and gatherings. I mean, they could hire rooms and things, but the tea house became a major part of the life of the suffragists and suffragette. And it's interesting that the suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst, who was a radical sort of left-winger, and she set up a suffragist movement in East London, living and working with the working class, a very different type of campaigner to her mother, and also her sisters, who threw her out, in fact, of the national suffragette movement. Sylvia Pankhurst set up a tea house. In fact, she set up a number of community projects, and one of them was the Mother's Arms. It wasn't just a tea house; it was a pub before, and then it became like a cafe and a place where they would run a nursery school, a Montessori school, and things. And again, also thinking of the settlement movement, which was very important in terms of the university settlement movement, like Toynbee Hall and Kingsley Hall, and I think Mary Ward settlements. There's loads of settlements throughout England, in fact, and throughout the world. They were where the middle class sort of university students would go and live with the poor and work with the poor and try and look at a fraternity in terms of their relationship and learning from each other. And the sisters, Doris and Muriel Lester, the Lester sisters as they were known, in East London, not far in fact from where Sylvia Pankhurst was working, they set up Kingsley Hall, named after their brother who died tragically young. And Kingsley Hall, before they set up Kingsley Hall, they changed their house, which was a terraced house, into a tea room and a meeting room, a non-alcoholic meeting room, a social room for the local community. And then they bought the house next door and extended to that, and then eventually they built Kingsley Hall. But it's interesting how, in terms of people to meet in public and to discuss the politics of community or the politics of living and having the voting rights, how they sort of focus upon people gathering together to drink tea or coffee. I mean, the coffee house was the tea house was like the 1890s. The coffee house was in 16 to 1700s, the coffee house, and that was called the penny university, because for a penny, if you went to the coffee house, you could then spend the rest of your time by the fire or whatever, reading the news sheets or the broadsheets, or having them read to you. People would run around the coffee houses with the latest news, and so that it was meant to be a place that class wasn't important, so long as you obeyed the rules of the coffee house. And it was seen to be a place where sedition could arise, in the sense of the corresponding societies that discussed rights, especially the rights of man, and Thomas Paine's book, and especially after the French Revolution and the problems that the French Revolution, the fear it inspired in the British aristocracy and the people of power, the men of power, and their fear that the rights revolution of France might affect the English. Anyway, so I like to think about that when we're thinking about the role, ironically, of tea breaks at Summerhill School. As I've said, Summerhill School has 2 tea breaks in the day, and we meet in the morning, 11:10, I think. It changes depending on the timetable, for about 20 minutes, where we serve tea, and the staff used to do it, I think. The teachers used to serve the tea, and you'd give out biscuits, and everyone would have 2 biscuits unless you had a biscuit fine from the meeting. Then you wouldn't have any, and it'd always be children and adults asking, do you want your biscuits, so that you could have more than 2. And then at the morning break, you could hear news about what's going on in the school, or whether we've got visitors, or so it's and we just discussed what had happened already that day. I mean, in order to have meetings, you always had to have a break, a community break, before actually holding an emergency meeting. So the school the chairperson could call an emergency meeting at any time that one was needed, but in order to make sure that everyone knew about it, you had to have a community break, so you could call a community meeting before breakfast, so everyone at breakfast would know about it, and that emergency meeting could then happen after morning tea break, or you could have it so it was just a way that we enabled the community to communicate about its emergency meetings and things. Okay, well, I'm going to start with going back quite some time, in fact, to this wonderful woman called Ethel Mannin. She visited Summerhill when it was in Lyme Regis, and she became a very, very important and enthusiastic supporter of A.S. Neil. She's a novelist. She wrote lots and lots of novels, and she was also influential in terms of the community that she was a part of. She was a lover of a number of famous thinkers and writers, and a friend of others. So in her book Confessions and Impressions by Ethel Mannin, she writes about the first time she meets A.S. Neil. She's been travelling, I think, to Europe. She's got a baby, a daughter, and she's travelling with some friends, and on the boat to Dieppe, she chats to them and says, they're talking about schooling and education, and she says to them, what do they think I should do with my daughter? And they all suggest that she should send her daughter to Summerhill, to A.S. Neil School. So she then organises to go and visit the school in Lyme Regis, and this is what she writes. The school was then at Lyme Regis, in a big square house at the top of a hill. The gates were painted black and orange, which I thought encouraging. I hardly know what I expected. There were a great many noises off, yells and whoops and shrieks and laughter, but nothing in view except a disconsolate-looking hen. walking across the untidy lawns. As many of you will know, the hens are still there, and the hens have always been walking around. Well, not at Lyme Regis now, but at Leicester in Suffolk. That there's always been disconsolate hens walking around Summerhill. The front door, also painted black and orange, was open, and I saw into a whitewashed hall with wildly futuristic paintings on the walls and coconut matting on the stained boards of the floor. I pulled the bell rope and the bell went clanging through the house, but for some time nothing happened. Finally, a black-haired, stockingless, sandalled young woman came round a corner and looked surprised to see me, although her smile was friendly enough. I explained who I was and said that I was expected. She said she would see if she could find anyone. She thought everyone had gone bathing, except a few of the kids. That I'd made a 5-hour train journey, was expected, and had arrived meticulously on time, obviously was of no importance. She showed me into a big room with more whitewashed walls and futuristic paintings. All discs and angles and cubes and distorted perspectives in the German vein. There was a grand piano in the room, and on it wild flowers in glass jam jars. There were also rickety-looking bookshelves, handmade, overflowing with books of all descriptions, English and German, novels, poets, works on psychology and psychoanalysis. There were basket chairs with orange cushions, and on the bare boards of the floor, Persian rugs. A shabby, untidy room, yet it somehow suggested light and air and personality. A room into which one might come and flop down and talk about oneself, or stay silent, as was most comfortable. A room in which you could sit with your feet on the mantelpiece and, if please you, and say anything you like. The more revolutionary and subversive, the better. Through the windows, a great cedar tree reached its arms out over a tennis lawn, and beyond it the sea, the colour of light merged in a shimmering opalescence with the sky. Whilst I looked about and waited and wondered, 2 boys and a girl, all hatless and in riding breeches, rode up on ponies and dismounted at the crumbling steps leading up to the front door. The girl, I afterwards learnt, was Homer Lane's daughter. Neil was one of Homer Lane's disciples, and to his everlasting credit had the courage not to withdraw his friendship or waver in his loyalty, either during or after that disgraceful trial. Finally, A.S. Neil came in. I must give my first impression of him, because now that I've known him for years and count him amongst my closest friends, it is more difficult to give a clear-cut impression. One grows used to one's friends and scarcely knows what they are like externally. But that hot summer afternoon when I met A.S. Neil for the first time, I have a vivid picture of a tall, thin, slightly stooping figure with a lean, clever, sensitive face. I had formed no conception of what I thought he would be like, but somehow he was right. Just as surely as had he been a little portly, thick-set figure, he would somehow have been all wrong. He wore grubby white flannels, an old and saggy tweed coat, and a gay, careless sort of tie and sandals. He always dresses carelessly like this. His long fingers were stained, as always, from the metalwork, which is his recreation from child psychology. He gave the impression of shyness, and one felt that he hoped he wasn't going to be asked a lot of tiresome questions. We talked for a bit, and he dexterously kept the conversation away from children, psychology and education. Interesting. Presently, other people drifted in, members of the staff. There were no introductions, and nobody seemed surprised to find a stranger in their midst. Being there, one was accepted without question. Orange cups and saucers made their appearance. A yellow-haired Swedish girl passed me a sandwich. People wandered in and out. It was all very casual. A simple, comfortable, unself-conscious, friendly sort of casualness. Infinitely refreshing. In such a community you might come and go as you please. Talk or remain silent as you wish. If you are there, food is put before you. If you don't happen to come in when food is being distributed, that is your lookout. You cannot expect people to fuss over you. Just as if you want to talk, there's always someone intelligent and sympathetic for an audience. And if you don't want to talk, nobody is going to mind. So that's Ethel Mannin, who sent her daughter there as a child, and who we'll come across again later in another episode. And she wrote some wonderful books, some of which were actually based at the school in Summerhill. So that's her impression of the school and Neil in Lyme Regis and in the staff room, where they're all having cups of tea, coffee and cake. So let's just see. Now the thing about when I arrived at Summerhill was that we had staff tea in the afternoon. So whilst the children and the rest of the community had tea at, I think, 3:30, or 3 o'clock, I think 3:30, we had afternoon tea. Our tea would be provided by Pat, who was the main housekeeper. She would make a tray and put on the tray biscuits and a huge teapot that you'd take into the staff room. So the staff at 3:30 would go, at tea time, would go to the staff room and we'd chat about our days and what happened that morning and that afternoon. And it was quite an important part of the staff sort of just connecting up. But there was a problem because, in a sense, we were not part of the children at that 3:30 like we were in the mornings. In the mornings, everyone got together at 11:15 or after 11 for community tea, but in the afternoons when I arrived, the staff would have their own, and also it would be brought to us as well by Pat, who was a lovely housekeeper. Now there was one of the staff got very annoyed with this and felt it was inappropriate, partly because of language difficulties. The staff at the time when I was there, a number of them were very good at sort of jokes to do with language, and they'd play a lot of Boggle, which is a game about trying to find out the words from letters and things, and Scrabble and that kind of game, and also games with humour with puns and plays on words. And this particular teacher wasn't English, and she hated that sense of humour, and she didn't really appreciate the conversation that went on at tea time. And she also, I think, had an issue that we weren't with the students, so she stopped going to afternoon tea with the staff and started going and joining the students in the dining room. And in the dining room, eventually the staff tea stopped, and we all started going to the dining room. I think it was because as new staff arrived, they sort of couldn't see why the staff would have their tea in the staff room. It's interesting because the dynamics of the staff, that when I arrived, we would meet a lot together as staff every day. So we would meet after lunch. Someone within the staff would invite all the staff to their caravan or their room, where they would make tea or coffee. So that would be after lunch in the afternoon, and then they would play games like word games and chat, and then we would have staff tea at 3:30, and then staff supper which is would be in the staff room again. So we'd use those times to actually just be able to talk without young people there, which is an interesting question. In fact, it did create a lot of tension sometimes with the students, especially staff suppers. But anyway. Oh, I remember when I first started working at Summerhill, Nathan invited me to tea with Ina. Ina was A.S. Neil's widow, and she had run the school after A.S. Neil's death and was a major part of the school during his life. And she was in an electric wheelchair when I arrived, that she'd used to go from the cottage where she lived by the entrance of the school. She would drive it down the drive to the main house, where she would then plant herself a lot of the time, I think, in the kitchen, so she could just see the school as it went past and say hello to people. But Nathan, who was one of the children, a very young child at the time, I think in class 1, he invited me to Ina's cottage to have tea with Ina. So I went, and there was me, Nathan, and Roland, who was the geography and humanities teacher. And Ina wanted to see what the new science teacher was like, and asked me, was I going to be a good science teacher? Which I wasn't quite sure how to respond to. I simply responded by saying that I was very enthusiastic and I hoped to share as much science as possible with the children. At the tea, it was interesting because Ina could be quite ferocious, and Roland was taking the best biscuits. And Ina told him off very severely for taking the best biscuits. And Roland said, well, if they're there. And he just spoke back to her as an equal. But sadly, I didn't see much of her after that. But anyway, that was me having tea with Ina. Now, tea is also organises events. So I would organise tea and coffee events, normally fair trade, for if we had guests or visitors. So some visitors would come and I'd say, look, can you meet up with the students and have a question and answer session with the students? So like Yaakov Heck, the guy from Israel who ran the biggest democratic school, I think one of the biggest in the world in Israel, Hadera. He quite often visited us, and I would get him up into the school cafe and I put posters around saying coffee and tea with Yaakov Heck and find out how he runs his school. And I do the same with any visitor that the students could come and meet. Including ex-students, and then I also organised ex-students to come and have tea and coffee in my housebound room, where I'd set up a camera and I would actually film the interviews and get the students to interview them. But this time it was specifically about what do you do after Summerhill, because there was a lot of discussion amongst the staff about how we prepare students for when they leave, and one of the things that was thought important was for the children to learn from other students who'd already left. So we'd invite students to come and meet ex-students and to find out how they left and what had happened to them and what was good about it, what was bad about it, so they could learn themselves from their older peers. And these were filmed and then put onto YouTube and onto a Facebook page as a library. I think I did about 13 different ex-students who had very different jobs, like musicians. We interviewed a doctor, we interviewed an artist, we interviewed can't remember what other jobs. Oh, an engineer, all ex-Summerhillians. And then Zoe. It was interesting that Zoe would use tea and coffee for chats with students, one-to-ones and things like that. But also in terms of when we had a court case, there was a sense of realisation that a lot of the students weren't necessarily good at verbalising it, at talking about their life at Summerhill, which was a very important thing for us at the time of the thorough closure, because the press would always be coming and also inspectors and things like that. So sometimes there would be tea and discussions about what is Summerhill and a bit with the history and things. And actually that helped create a course, in fact, which I helped with, where we did an 8-week course of sessions on Summerhill for students and staff, but I think only the students came on, and we looked at the history of the school and the importance of landscape, the importance of the meeting, and how it all linked to the history of the school. And so we'd also have tea and coffee, just to remind people of the ethos and ethics of Summerhill and the values. And this would happen. It happened partly out of the court case, but also later on in terms of when the school was feeling particularly weak in terms of the carriage students, the older students, sort of challenging the values of the school or not appearing to care about them, and Zoe sort of calling it a community discussion, really, just to remind people about what the values were. And my last story to do with tea is about the little Commonwealth. Homer Lane tells a story. I think it's either he may tell it in his he tells it in his talks, because I don't think he wrote anything. It was his talks were written down, but and then published. But I'm not sure if he wrote anything. But there's a story told where one of the students is very angry and starts breaking the teacups, and he joins in and breaks all the teacups. And then there's a meeting of the little Commonwealth of the others, and they're very angry with the young man, but they're angrier with Homer Lane because they're the teacups. How dare he? He thought, sharing, the view, taking the viewpoint of the child and taking the role of the child and the side of the child, that he would join in with breaking the teacups with this angry child. But the other children were even angrier because they were there. They were the community's teacups, and how dare he disrespect the rest of the whole community through breaking everyone's teacups. So I think they have a community meeting to discuss what should happen to Homer Lane and what should happen to the young lad who started breaking the teacups. So what do I think about this space? I think it's really important that we think about the different spaces of Summerhill, and those spaces to do with community spaces, not necessarily spaces in terms of landscape where people walk through, or and especially with this, not classrooms, but places where opinions can be expressed and visitors can be chatted to, and thoughts and ideas and values. And I think the tea break and meeting with tea are very important aspects of thinking and sharing ideas, and also of the continuity of the values of the school. That Summerhill has lasted over 100 years with the same continuous sense of values. And if you look at the community meeting minutes now, they're very similar to community meeting minutes in the 30s, 40s and 50s. And I think part of this is the conversation that happens around the pot of tea. Thank you very much indeed.